1938, Millbrook, Wyoming. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and desperation that September morning, cutting through the valley like a blade. It came sweeping down from the Bighorn Mountains, scattering dried leaves across the depot platform and coating everything in fine red dust. Beatrice Sigrid walked slowly away from the station, her shoulders curved inward like parentheses around her pain. One battered valise hung from her left hand, a baby girl pressed against her right hip. 3 more children trailed behind her, silent as ghosts in worn-through shoes. She had nowhere to turn. The manager at the lumber mill had shaken his head before she'd finished speaking. The woman at the general store had pretended not to hear. The pastor's wife had offered prayers but no work, her eyes sliding away like water off wax. "Not in times like these," they said without saying it. The town had its own scars, the depression still fresh, jobs scarce as summer rain. Millbrook wasn't heartless, just hungry. Everyone was holding on by their fingernails, and there was no room for a woman with 4 mouths to feed and nothing to trade but desperation. Her boots kicked up dust as she walked. By the time the road bent away from town and into the open country, she'd gone nearly 4 miles. The valise felt like it had stones in it. The baby whimpered softly. Beatrice's own stomach had been empty since yesterday noon, but she kept her face smooth. The children needed to see strength, even if it was borrowed from a place she no longer believed existed. There was a hollow in the land just past a dried creek bed where wild ryegrass grew tall and golden. She crossed to it and set down the valise, then the baby, then herself. The children gathered close without a word, their faces pale as parchment beneath the dirt. Their clothes still smelled of the train, coal smoke and strangers' sweat. She pulled her knees up, pressed her forehead against them, and closed her eyes. One thought hammered inside her skull. You don't get to quit. Not now. She thought of the house in Nebraska, of her husband's cold silence the morning he walked out. No explanation, just his good boots missing and the truck gone from the yard. There had been rumors afterward. A woman in Cheyenne, gambling debts. Beatrice had stopped listening. What mattered was the emptiness he left behind, the weight she now carried alone. A truck engine growled up the road. She didn't look up. It slowed, stopped. Boots hit gravel. A man's voice, rough but not unkind, called out, "Ma'am, you all right out here?" She lifted her head but said nothing. Her throat felt lined with cotton. He stepped closer. Tall man, broad in the shoulders, hat pulled low against the glare. His face looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him, weathered and permanent. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. "Just saw the little ones, figured maybe you needed help." She nodded once, cautious. The children stared up at him with wide, wary eyes. "I've got a ranch about 10 miles west," he continued, gesturing toward the truck. "Name's Fletcher Harper, was heading back with supplies. If you need a warm place for the night, if you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 100 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to my channel and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent." Now, let's continue. She stood slowly, picked up the baby, then the valise. Didn't answer, just started walking toward the truck. He didn't rush to help, just walked alongside her, matching her pace. The kids climbed in first. She followed. The warmth inside hit her like a fist, and her throat tightened. She swallowed it down hard. He climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. They drove for a long stretch without speaking. Finally, just before the road turned toward the foothills, he asked, "What can you do?" It wasn't cruel, wasn't suspicious, just practical, like he wanted to know what parts of her were still intact. She glanced sideways at him. "I can cook," she said. "Clean, mend what's torn. I can read and cipher. I work hard. I don't make trouble." She paused. I can hold 4 children and still split kindling." He gave a small nod. "That'll do," he said. They didn't speak again the rest of the way. When the ranch finally came into view, low buildings set against the sweep of the mountains, it looked like something from a dream she'd had once and forgotten. She didn't let herself hope, not yet, but she watched the lamplight in the windows and listened to the wind singing through the fence wire, and she held her children tighter, thinking maybe, just maybe, this was a place where she could make something again, even if it was only herself. The cabin wasn't much. 2 rooms, cracked plaster, a potbelly stove in the corner, but it was dry and warmer than anything they'd known in weeks. Fletcher handed her a key ring, told her the well was out back, and left them alone without asking questions. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed that first night, the baby asleep against her chest. The others curled together beneath a quilt that smelled of cedar and horses. She watched their small chests rise and fall. The silence in the room was heavy, but it didn't crush her. Her hands trembled, slow and steady. Sleep didn't come. In the dark, her mind circled through the months behind her, the pawned wedding ring, the shoes too small for her eldest son, the day she'd begged for bread at the back door of a church and been turned away with tight smiles and tighter hearts. She had done what she had to, told small lies, bartered her dignity for calories, suffered the sideways looks, carried the shame in her spine like an iron rod. Now she sat in a stranger's cabin with no money, no friends, and no promise beyond morning. Still, it was the first time in months. She wasn't afraid someone might take her children while she slept. The next day she woke before dawn, moved quietly, tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, and stepped outside where frost clung to every blade of grass like lace. The air smelled of animals and pine and the sharp metallic bite of early morning. She found Fletcher in the barn, shoulder deep in grain sacks. "Tell me where to start," she said. He didn't blink. "You know horses?" She hesitated. "Not much." "Cattle?" "Less." "Then we start with chickens," he said. He showed her how to rake out the coop, how to hold the feed bucket just high enough to keep the birds from mobbing her. She listened carefully, watched his hands. He worked without wasted motion, every movement deliberate. He didn't talk more than necessary, but he wasn't unkind. When she stumbled, he didn't scold, just stepped in, showed her again, stepped back. They worked side by side for most of the day. The children stayed close, gathering eggs in a basket and whispering to the barn cats through the slats. At one point, her youngest boy fell in the mud and cried until Fletcher handed him a carrot and said, "Ain't no shame in getting dirty, son. World's full of worse things." Beatrice couldn't remember the last time someone spoke to her children like they were worth something. By dusk, she was bone-tired and sore in every joint. But it was a good kind of tired, earned, honest. She didn't expect Fletcher to bring them supper, but he did. A pot of stew thick with potatoes and venison, still steaming, left it on the step with half a loaf of bread and a folded note. "Tomorrow, if you're willing, we'll mend the gate near the north pasture." That was all. She held the note in her hands for a long time before setting it down beside the empty bowls. Later, after the children had fallen asleep again, she stepped outside. The stars overhead were brighter than she remembered stars could be. The wind had gone still. The night was quiet except for the lowing of cattle somewhere far off. She didn't cry. Not quite. But the tight knot in her chest loosened enough to let air in. Inside, one of the children murmured in sleep. She went back in, pulled the blanket tighter around their shoulders, and sat by the stove until the red glow turned to ash. Something had shifted, not much, not loud, but she felt it. A place to work, a roof, a man who didn't flinch at her story or scold her children for being hungry. She still didn't trust it, not yet, but maybe it didn't have to be trust. Maybe just one day at a time would be enough. The gate near the north pasture hung crooked on rusted hinges, sagging under its own weight like an old man too tired to stand. Beatrice stood there with a hammer in one hand and cold wind in her face. Fletcher pointed to a rotted post in the middle. "That one's the worst. If we don't fix it, the herd'll push through and we'll spend all week rounding them up." He handed her a glove with the torn thumbs. She pulled it on anyway. They worked in silence, the kind that didn't feel strained. She held the post while he drove it into the ground. When the wire slipped, she steadied it. When her grip failed, he caught it without comment. Once, she noticed a thick scar running across the back of his hand. Looked like it had been there a long time. She didn't ask. He didn't offer. Around noon, he sat down beneath a twisted juniper tree and opened a tin of beans. He passed it to her first. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. "My father used to call this cowboy gold," he said, not quite smiling. "You have a father?" "Had. Died in 1929. Heart gave out while he was shoeing a horse." She nodded. There was no right thing to say. But the way he said it, matter of fact, no self-pity, made her feel like maybe grief didn't always have to be a wound. Maybe it could just be another weight you carried, like a post or a sack of grain. He didn't ask about her husband. He never did. Instead, he talked about the land, how it had come to him piecemeal after his father passed, how the pastures used to be full before the drought came hard 2 summers in a row, how he'd nearly sold the place twice but hadn't. "Didn't know where else I'd go," he said. "Some things just stick to your bones." She understood that. When they finished eating, they got back to work. Her arms ached, her fingers blistered, but she didn't complain. That night, back in the cabin, she found her oldest boy sitting up with a tattered book in his lap, mouthing the words slowly, tracing each line with his finger. "Where'd you get that?" she asked softly. "Mr. Harper gave it to me," he said. "Said there's a whole shelf in the house. Said I could borrow more." She knelt beside him and turned the page. "Did you say thank you?" He nodded. She kissed the top of his head. The next morning, Fletcher brought her a second coat. "Too small for me," he said, shrugging. "Figured you could use it." She took it. "Thank you." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You've been good help." That was all he said, but it settled in her chest like warmth. The days began to fall into a rhythm. Work at sunup, rest at noon, supper quiet but shared. The children followed Fletcher like he was some tall, steady thing they could lean against. He showed them how to hold a rope, how to calm a spooked horse with a gentle hand. Beatrice watched all of it with a strange ache in her throat. One evening, after the youngest had fallen asleep, Beatrice stayed behind and helped Fletcher close up the barn. He didn't ask her to, she just did. When the last latch was fastened and the tools hung, she turned to go but paused. "Why'd you stop for us that day?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Then, "Saw your oldest wave at the truck. Just a little thing, barely moved his hand. Reminded me of someone, that's all." She waited, thinking maybe he'd say more, but he didn't. He tipped his hat. "Sleep well?" She watched him walk toward the house, tall and quiet under the wide sweep of stars, and felt something open in her. Not joy exactly, but a loosening, like ice beginning to thaw. A life was not a thing you found. It was a thing you built, one board at a time, with your hands blistered and your heart unsure. She turned toward the cabin, the door faintly lit from within, and let herself hope. Just a little. By spring, the valley had softened. Snow retreated up the slopes, and green crept into the meadows like breath returning to a sleeping body. The scrub oaks stood taller, still bare, but holding promise. The hens laid steady now. Calves had come late in March, and Beatrice had been there for 2 of them, kneeling in straw with her sleeves rolled up, steady and calm, just as Fletcher had shown her. They were working in rhythm now. She rose before light, boiled coffee strong, and had biscuits in the pan before the youngest stirred. The cabin no longer smelled like cold smoke and old wool. It smelled like soap, like warm bread, like living. She had started reading again, borrowed the books Fletcher offered. Old ones, mostly westerns and almanacs. But she read them anyway, her lips moving just a little as she went. The children read too. They fought less, laughed more. Sometimes Fletcher brought little things for them, an old pocket knife, a carved wooden horse, a tin whistle that squeaked when the youngest tried to blow it. She thanked him for everything, but it was never enough. Not really. He'd given them more than shelter and food. He'd given them a way to keep standing. Still, no one in town quite looked her in the eye. Some women at the feed store crossed the street when she came near. She saw the looks, heard the low mutters behind hands. Took up with a rancher just like that. Heard she ran off her husband. Heard those kids ain't even his. Heard she was on the street. Fletcher never asked what they said, but she knew he heard it. He just kept on. Same as before. Fence, road, hall, quiet, steady. But something had shifted. One night she found him sitting on the porch steps, smoking. She stood behind him for a moment, unsure. "They say I'm sleeping in your house," she said. "Say the kids call you Daddy now." He didn't turn. "Do they?" "No," she said, then quieter. "But they might." Still, he said nothing. She came and sat beside him. They watched the stars pull thin light across the dark. He didn't touch her. He never had. But sometimes she caught him watching her, not like a man with hunger, but like someone studying something precious and breakable. "I don't want to ruin what you have here," she said. His jaw moved once, then again. "You didn't." He flicked the cigarette into the dirt and pressed it out with his boot. "I was here working this land alone, speaking only when I had to. People respected me, sure, but they didn't really know me. Didn't ask." He paused. "You did." A long silence passed between them. The only sound was a night bird calling far off. Then he stood. "Come on, kids'll worry." She followed. The days warmed. Work got harder in a different way, mending fence in heat that clung to skin, calves that wandered. The pump broke twice. Then came news from Nebraska, a letter hand-delivered by a deputy from the next county over. Her name in harsh letters across the front. It was from her husband. Not dead, not lost. He wanted the children. Said she'd abandoned him. Claimed he had family now, a home. Claimed she had no right to keep them hidden. She read the words once, standing under the cottonwood near the well, then folded it small and shoved it in her apron pocket. Fletcher found her there, white-faced and still. "You all right?" She handed him the letter. He read it slow, then read it again. His face didn't change much, but his hands did, tightened, then stilled. "Is he telling the truth?" he asked. She shook her head. He left. No word, no money, no food. "I waited until the snow melted. Then I took what I could carry and got on a train." Fletcher looked at the dirt for a long time, then said, "You'll need someone on your side." She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. They were no longer two people who happened to be surviving in the same place. They were something else now. She felt it in the way he stepped closer, just enough that she could feel the heat from him. In the way his voice softened, low and sure. "I won't let him take them," he said. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that. She nodded once. He didn't touch her. Not yet. But in that moment she would have let him. The lawyer came from Sheridan in a truck too clean for country roads. He wore a pressed suit and a look like he'd already made up his mind. They sat at Fletcher's kitchen table. Beatrice wore her only good blouse, hair pulled back, hands folded so tight her knuckles ached. Fletcher sat beside her, silent as stone, one arm resting on the table like he was bracing against a blow. The man pulled out a folder, spread papers across the table. "Mr. Sigrid's filed for custody," he said. "Claims you left without cause, that you're unfit, that the children are his." "He left," she said, voice steady. "I waited 3 months. He never sent a dime. Do you have proof of that?" She shook her head. The lawyer sighed through his nose. Then it becomes his word against yours." He paused. "Unless," he glanced at Fletcher, measured him, "unless Mr. Harper can testify to the children's welfare, or if there's a legal relationship between you two." Beatrice's stomach dropped. Fletcher didn't flinch. "Explain," he said. The man shrugged. "If you were married, formally, legally, it would give her standing, a home, stability, judges like that." No one spoke. The wind shifted outside, slapping the screen door against its frame. Somewhere in the distance, a cow bellowed. Beatrice stared down at the table. Her heart beat so hard it felt like it was echoing in her ears. She'd been someone's wife before, worn the ring, said the vows. She'd known what it was to hand yourself over to someone who turned away. She wasn't sure she could survive doing it again. She stood. "I need air." Fletcher didn't follow. She stepped outside. The children were in the yard, chasing each other between the fence posts, laughing, free. They didn't know what the paper inside meant, what it threatened. She leaned her hands against the railing and stared out across the land. It was Fletcher's land, his name on the deed, his house, his barn, his hands that had built and fixed and carried. But it was her children's laughter in the yard, her biscuits in the kitchen, her stitching in the curtains, her life, too. Fletcher came out after a time. Didn't say anything, just stood beside her. "I'm not asking you," he said. She turned her head. "I'm not asking you to marry me out of fear," he went on, "or out of duty. I'm not offering a name like it's something to fix you." She said nothing. "I've watched you," he said, softer now. "Watched you carry more than any woman should. Watched you raise those kids without bitterness. I'd marry you today, tomorrow, or not at all. Just say the word. But whatever happens with that man, you're not facing him alone." She stared at him, noticed the flecks of gray in his beard, the way the sun lined his face, the cut on his knuckle from the fence wire yesterday. He wasn't offering rescue. He was offering his presence. There was a difference. She reached for his hand, held it firm and certain. "You'd marry a woman with 4 kids," she said, "a past and a broken heart." "I'd be proud to," he said. And then, for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Beatrice Sigrid let herself want something, really want it. Not just survival, not just shelter, a life with this man on this land. And so they married. It was quiet. The children wore clean clothes. She wore a borrowed dress. The preacher from town read the words plain and slow, and when he asked if they promised to stand together, Beatrice said yes with no tremble in her voice. Fletcher looked at her like she was made of something strong, something sacred, and when he kissed her, it felt like coming home. The lawyer filed the paperwork 2 days later, and the next time a letter came from Nebraska, it came through official channels, and it was met with a letter in return. Signed, Mrs. Beatrice Harper. She didn't know how the court would rule, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't bracing for the worst. She was standing beside someone who would stand beside her, no matter what came next. The hearing was set for late July. They borrowed a truck with good tires and made the drive to the courthouse in Sheridan. Pressed clothes and silence. The children stayed behind with the neighbor woman who'd helped with calving in the spring. Beatrice watched the plains roll past the window, wide and golden, stretching all the way to the mountains. The sun was fierce and high. Her palms were damp. Fletcher drove without rush, one hand on the wheel, the other resting loose on his knee. Every now and then he'd glance over, not with worry, just to remind her he was still there. They arrived an hour early and waited on a bench outside the courtroom. Her husband, former husband, arrived 5 minutes before the gavel drop. He looked older, his face puffy, hair gone thin. He wore a suit he didn't know how to fit, the shoulders too tight, the tie crooked, but his smile was still the same, smug, hollow. He didn't look at the children's photos on the table, didn't ask how they were, just sat down with his lawyer and passed her a wink. She stared straight ahead. The judge was a man, gray-haired and stern. No smile. Both sides spoke. Papers were passed. Stories told. The other man said Beatrice left out of spite. Said she poisoned the kids against him. Claimed she'd shacked up with a stranger, using the children as leverage. Fletcher spoke next. His voice was calm, steady. He told them how he met Beatrice, what he'd seen, what she'd done on his ranch, how the children had thrived under her care, how she rose before the sun, read to her kids each night, and taught his household how to laugh again. She didn't come here broken, he said. She came here burning, and she kept burning, that kind of fire, you don't see it twice. When it was Beatrice's turn, her voice shook at first, but she told the truth in plain, clear words. She told them how she had waited, how she'd fed her children salt and hot water when there was nothing else, how she'd walked town to town until someone finally asked her what she could do instead of what she'd done. She told them she was no saint, but she was a mother, and she had not stopped being one, not even in the darkest parts. When it ended, the judge said he would consider. They drove home with the windows down. The sky was turning pink by the time they saw the outline of the ranch. Beatrice let the wind tangle her hair and didn't reach for her scarf. Fletcher pulled into the drive, killed the engine. They sat there a moment. Then he reached across the seat, covered her hand with his. "You did good," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not sure it'll matter." "It matters to me." She didn't cry, not quite, but her chest felt tight and full in a way she hadn't let herself feel in years. 2 weeks later, a letter came. The custody was denied. Full guardianship was awarded to Beatrice Harper, with the court recognizing Fletcher as a legal co-guardian by marriage and shared residence. She read the letter twice, standing barefoot in the doorway, the smell of coffee and summer dust in the air. She handed it to Fletcher without a word. He read it once, folded it, and tucked it in his back pocket. Then he reached for her. They didn't speak, just held each other, standing there in the morning light while one of the kids called for breakfast. The days that followed felt different, though little changed. She still rose early, still packed lunches, still wiped mud from small boots, and sorted beans from grain. But she smiled more now, laughed quicker. Fletcher built a shelf for her books, carved her name into the side, so small she almost didn't see it. She planted wildflowers near the porch. The children began to call him Pa, without anyone asking them to. They began to speak of next year, of Christmas, of someday. And Beatrice, who had once walked with her head down and her jaw clenched against the world, lifted her face to the sky more often now. Let the sun touch her, let herself be seen, let herself belong. By the time fall rolled in, the apple trees behind the house had begun to bear again. Not much, just a few small fruits clinging to crooked branches, but Beatrice picked them anyway. She filled a basket with what she could find and boiled them down with cinnamon and a little sugar, the kind you scrape from the bottom of an old jar. Fletcher came in late from the barn that night, smelled the pie on the stove, and just stood there in the doorway, watching her move about the kitchen like he'd never seen anything sweeter. He set his hat on the peg. "Smells like something worth staying alive for." She looked up from the counter. "Might be." They ate together. The children crowded around the table, fighting over crust and asking for seconds. Afterward, Beatrice sat on the porch with her knitting while Fletcher tuned the old radio in the window, catching some war report out of Europe, crackling and thin. The world kept turning out there, spinning with trouble, but the ranch stood steady. That night, after the children had been tucked into their bunks and the house had gone quiet, Fletcher came to her, slow, asking nothing, giving everything. They did not speak vows again. They didn't need to. The way he touched her was its own kind of promise. He saw her. Not just her softness or her strength, but the whole of her, rough edges and quiet grief and the way she still flinched when doors slammed. And she saw him, how lonely he'd been, how he'd built a life of routine and silence, never expecting anything more. They met there in that space. No masks, no debts, Just two people who had lived too much and still dared to want something more. Afterwards, she lay with her head on his chest, listening to his breathing and the ticking of the wall clock. "I was thinking," he said, voice low, "about building a second room onto the cabin." She shifted. "Why?" "For your sewing, and maybe a bigger bed. These kids will outgrow those cots soon." She smiled into his shirt. "They're already halfway there." He stroked her hair. "Then we'd best get to building." Winter came fast. With it came snow that buried the fence lines and wind that howled straight through the shutters. But the house was ready this year. Wood stacked high, pantry full, coats patched and boots handed down in neat rows. Beatrice had never known this kind of stillness, not absence of suffering stillness, fullness, a quiet built of effort and care. She no longer feared the lean months. She met them head on, with lists in her apron and flour on her cheek. One morning she stood at the sink, washing dishes, and paused, pressed a hand low against her belly. Something fluttered, small, new. She didn't say anything right away. Let it sit. Let it grow. Weeks passed and her dresses fit differently. She tired faster. Fletcher noticed, of course, but didn't ask until she came to him one night, took his hand and placed it where the flutter was strongest. His face broke open, barely, but enough for her to see the man beneath all that quiet. "I didn't think," he started, then stopped. "I didn't either," she whispered. He held her as if he understood the weight of what she carried. Not just the child, but the fear, the hope, the fragile wonder of starting again. Later, he hung a tiny pair of carved wooden boots over the fireplace, same shape as the ones he wore every day. "Just in case it's a boy," he said. "And if it's a girl," she said, "then she'll wear them anyway." That spring, a barn dance was held in town. First in years. Fletcher didn't want to go. "Too many eyes," he said, but Beatrice looked at him and said, "Let them look." So they went. She wore her best blue dress, belly just starting to show. He wore a clean shirt and boots he hadn't dusted off since his father died. They danced once, just once, but it was enough. The music wound down and someone offered them a drink, and another person asked after the baby, and soon they were sitting at a table near the back, laughing. The kind of laughing that only comes when you've made it through hell and still found something good waiting on the other side. Fletcher looked at her then, and his eyes were soft. "You sure you're happy?" he asked. She nodded slow. "I didn't think I would be again, but I am." The sun dipped behind the hills as they drove home. The truck full of tired children, the baby in her belly turning, like it already knew the way home. The baby came on a warm August morning when the light had that golden edge, and the whole valley buzzed with grasshoppers. Beatrice had been baking when the first pain caught her. She leaned hard against the table and didn't cry out, just breathed through it slow and even, and told the oldest to go find Fletcher. He came running from the barn, hands still covered in grease from a broken pulley. Saw her face, pale but steady, and nodded once. Said nothing, just helped her to the bedroom and called for the midwife from down the road. The labor was long, but not cruel. Beatrice bore it the way she'd borne everything else in her life, with grit, silence, and something deeper than strength. When the baby came, she didn't cry right away, just blinked up at Beatrice with wide, calm eyes, as if she'd arrived from someplace holy and didn't see the need for fuss. "A girl." Fletcher held her like he'd been handed a lantern in a dark room. "She's got your eyes," he whispered. "No," Beatrice said, smiling weakly. "She's got her own." They named her Clara, and after the others had come in to see her, to stroke her tiny hands and whisper secrets, Beatrice leaned back against the pillows, half asleep, and felt something she hadn't known she was missing. Peace, not relief, not safety, just peace. By winter, Clara was cooing and grabbing fistfuls of Fletcher's shirt with surprising strength. The other children adored her. Even the eldest, now taller than Beatrice's shoulder, softened around her. Fletcher built a new crib by hand, carving flowers into the sides. He never said why, but Beatrice knew. His mother's garden, long gone now. He carried things in quiet ways. The town softened too, little by little. People who had once looked through her now waved from their wagons. The feed store woman offered cloth scraps for sewing. A neighbor asked if her boys could help with branding come spring. Nobody asked about her past anymore. They saw what mattered. They saw the family she had built, the land she helped tend, the children who looked people in the eye now, unafraid. She planted a row of wildflowers along the fence that year. Fletcher teased her for it. "Not much use in them," he. "They make me smile," she answered. "That's use enough." He let them be. Years passed like that. The apple trees bloomed better each spring. The children grew strong, straight-backed, and kind-hearted. The cabin became the sewing room, then a schoolroom, then a quiet space for guests when old friends came through. One summer, Beatrice found her old valise stored away in the loft, still full of clothes that didn't fit and papers that no longer mattered. She opened it, sat with it for a while, then closed it for good. She didn't need to remember who she had been. She knew who she was. Beatrice Harper, mother, wife, maker of bread and peace and strong boys who respected women, and a daughter who never flinched at thunder. The woman no one had hired. The woman one man had believed in enough to ask a single question: "What can you do?" She had answered with truth, not shame, and together they had built a life sturdy enough to hold love. One evening, after the chores were done and the porch had cooled, Fletcher sat beside her, watching the sky fade to violet. "Ever think about leaving?" he asked, not looking at her. "Sometimes," she said, "but never seriously." "Why not?" She thought about it, then nodded toward the field where the wind moved through the grass like breath. "Because I never knew the world could feel like this." She paused, "Like it might let me stay." He reached for her hand. His was worn smooth from work, still strong, but gentler now. "You ain't going anywhere," he said. She smiled. The children's voices echoed through the yard. The baby, no longer a baby, was laughing, chasing after her brothers. The wildflowers leaned into the last of the light. Somewhere, a window glowed warm. A home, built slow and honest, stood behind them. A life, stitched from hardship, now whole. Beatrice leaned her head against Fletcher's shoulder, watched the light fade, and knew, finally, this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of another. Let us know where you're watching from in the comment, subscribe, and stay tuned for more.